Okay, so get ready because we're going deep on this one, and it might kind of flip your thinking on its head.
Ooh, I like that.
Today we're diving into a topic that's pretty much guaranteed to stir up some strong opinions.
Sounds fun.
Colonialism.
Ooh, yeah, this will be good.
Now, before you think we're about to launch into some kind of historical apology tour, let me just be super clear. We're here to explore a perspective that really challenges that kind of common narrative about colonialism.
It's really interesting how much we hear about, all the bad sides of colonialism,
Right.
but you rarely ever hear anything that kind of challenges that view.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the source material for this deep dive. It's a collection of essays and excerpts by Bruce Gilley.
Oh, okay.
Altogether they make the case for colonialism. And I know what you're probably thinking. Isn't this the guy that got, death threats for his views?
Yeah, he's a bit controversial.
And you'd be absolutely right.
Yeah.
But honestly, that really intense reaction just makes it even more important to understand what he's actually saying,
It does. At the heart of his argument
Yeah.
is this idea that colonialism, at least in a lot of cases, actually benefited the people who were colonized.
Wow.
He suggests that a lot of the research that condemns colonialism might be missing a really crucial element.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that?
What might have happened if European powers hadn't intervened in these regions in the first place?
Okay, so you're saying he's like, we need to consider that, what's the word?
The counterfactual.
Yes, the counterfactual. What's the alternative history here?
Yeah.
Like, what if, right?
Exactly.
Okay, I like it.
And he looks at some really well-known examples to illustrate this point.
Okay, like what?
He critiques Adam Hochschild's book, King Leopold's Ghost.
Oh, right, about the atrocities in the Congo Free State.
While acknowledging the brutality of King Leopold II's rule, Gilley argues that Hochschild doesn't really address the state of the Congo before Leopold.
Okay, so then what was going on in the Congo before the Belgians colonized it?
Well, that's where things get a little complicated.
Um,
Historical records tell us that the region was kind of already a pretty rough place.
Yeah.
Like a lot of violence and exploitation going on, often at the hands of local warlords and slave traders.
Right. Yeah.
So Gilley says the question isn't really about whether colonialism was perfect.
Right.
It's more about whether it was better than what was already happening.
Oh, I see. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It makes you think about history not as this simple, good versus evil story.
Exactly.
It's more complicated than that.
And he kind of applies the same idea to the 1619 Project.
Okay, which, remind me, focuses on...
The legacy of slavery in the U.S.
Right, the enduring legacy of slavery in the United States.
He argues that while it shines a light on, the undeniable horrors of slavery,
Of course, yeah.
it doesn't really engage with, the full picture of the transatlantic slave trade.
Oh, what kind of complexities is he talking about?
Well, for one thing, he points out the internal African slave trade that existed long before Europeans ever got involved.
Right, yeah.
He also questions whether the lives of the people enslaved in the U.S. were necessarily worse.
Oh, okay.
Compared to the lives they might have had
Right.
they stayed in Africa.
So essentially, he's not trying to say slavery was good.
No.
He's not condoning it at all.
Not at all.
He's just saying,
Look at the bigger picture.
yeah, consider it all, right.
The historical context.
The historical context.
Yeah.
It sounds like he's pushing back against
Yeah.
this idea of colonialism just being pure evil.
Yeah, it seems like he sees that as overly simplistic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He even points out a certain irony in how some anti-colonial thinkers kind of operate.
Okay, what do you mean?
They love scientific objectivity and hard evidence
Right.
when it supports their views.
Uh-huh.
But according to Gilley, that same rigor just disappears when it comes to their own beliefs about colonialism. Wow, that is kind of ironic, isn't it?
A little bit.
So how does Gilley actually back up his argument that colonialism could be beneficial?
Well, he gives a range of examples.
Okay.
One of the most compelling ones is his analysis of German East Africa.
German East Africa. That's
No,
right.
German colonialism definitely had its share of problems, but
right.
Gilley argues that their administration in East Africa implemented policies that led to really significant economic growth
Okay.
and improvements in living standards.
Interesting. How did that compare to, let's say, British colonialism?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Gilley says that the British, who are often praised for, their administration skills,
Their administration.
sometimes actually lagged behind
Right.
in terms of development. He attributes that to the Germans' more hands-on and development-focused approach.
So he's saying that different colonial powers had, like, different impacts, right? It's not accurate to lump them all together.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Mm.
And to kind of drive this point home, he introduces this fictional Nigerian man named Baba.
Baba.
Yeah.
Okay.
Baba is a character in one of his essays.
Okay.
And he defends British rule to a Western academic, arguing that the British brought peace and prosperity to his people.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He even challenges the academic's focus on the atrocities of colonialism,
Interesting.
suggesting that worse things happened in Africa,
Oh,
both before and after colonial rule, but we don't hear about those as much.
that's a pretty powerful counter-narrative.
Yeah.
It really does seem like Gilly is trying to get us to rethink our assumptions, you know?
Yeah, shake things up a bit.
Yeah, shake things up. He even brings up someone who's often celebrated for his critiques of colonialism.
Yeah.
Chinua Achebe.
Oh, yeah.
Achebe, the author of Things Fall Apart. Isn't he a really strong critic of colonialism?
He is, yeah. But Gilly points out that Achebe also acknowledged some of the good things about British rule, particularly in terms of unifying Nigeria and creating a sense of national identity.
So even some of the most vocal critics of colonialism acknowledge that it wasn't all entirely bad, right?
Exactly.
It's interesting how Gilly highlights those more nuanced views, right?
It makes you wonder if we often oversimplify history.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
We focus on the extremes instead of the complexities, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
It definitely raises questions about how we think about history
It does.
and how we form opinions about the past.
Uh,
But there's one part of Gilly's argument that I'm kind of struggling with.
oh, what's that?
His idea of recolonization.
Yes. That is definitely the most controversial part of his work.
Yeah.
But before we jump to conclusions, I think it's important to understand what he's actually proposing.
Okay, I'm listening.
He's not saying we should go back to, like that old school colonialism.
Right.
The kind that was all about exploiting resources and people.
Yeah, that was awful.
No, he's talking about something different.
Okay.
He's suggesting that in certain situations, a new kind of colonial governance, one that's, learned from past mistakes and really focuses on the well-being of the population, might actually be a solution to the problems some regions are facing today.
Okay, I'm trying to keep an open mind here.
I know, it's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it is. Could you give me like a concrete example?
Absolutely. He points to places like Liberia and Chad, where organizations like the World Bank and USAID have experimented with what they call shared sovereignty arrangements.
Shared sovereignty, what does that even mean?
It's kind of complicated, but basically it involves a partnership between a developing country and a more developed nation or an international organization.
Okay.
They work together on things like governance and development with the goal of creating more stability and encouraging economic growth.
So it's more collaborative.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like that old top-down model of colonialism.
Right.
Okay, I see.
And he also mentions charter cities.
Oh, yes.
What are those?
Those are kind of like self-governing zones within a country. Oh, wow.
They have their own rules and laws, and often they get support from foreign powers.
So they're like little mini countries?
Kinda, yeah. The idea is that they can act as testing grounds for economic and social progress.
Oh, I see. So they can try out new ideas and see what works.
Exactly.
Interesting. It does sound kind of futuristic.
It does a bit, yeah.
Okay, so even if we consider this recolonization idea, how do we make sure it doesn't just turn into another form of exploitation?
That's the big question, right?
It is.
Gilly knows there's a risk of abuse.
Yeah.
He says any new form of colonial governance would have to be structured very carefully to avoid those old mistakes.
Okay.
He emphasizes things like transparency, accountability, and a genuine commitment to the well-being of the local people.
That all makes sense.
Yeah.
It's just a lot to think about.
It is.
As we're talking about these potential downsides of, post-colonial governance.
Yeah.
I keep thinking about that example Gilly brings up, Zanzibar.
Yes, Zanzibar.
Yeah. It's a fascinating case study.
It really is.
It challenges that simple narrative that colonialism is bad and independence is good.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because things didn't go so well for Zanzibar after they got independence, did they?
No, not really.
Yeah.
Gilly argues that the revolution in 1964, the one that overthrew the Sultan and brought in socialist rule, well, that led to a lot of suffering and human rights abuses.
Yeah. Decades of hardship.
What was the main reason behind that revolution anyway?
Well, Gilly argues that it was fueled by the wave of anti-colonial sentiment that was sweeping the globe at the time.
Right.
It's kind of ironic because
Yeah.
he points out that people like Gamal Nasser in Egypt,
Yeah, who was a big critic of Western imperialism.
yeah, actually used former Nazis.
Whoa.
Yeah, to spread anti-Western propaganda in the Middle East.
That is pretty shocking,
Yeah, history is full of surprises.
It really shows you how complicated these ideological battles can be.
Absolutely.
And the result in Zanzibar, it wasn't what people had hoped for.
No, not at all.
Gilly says that it led to violence, political repression, the economy went downhill, and a lot of Arab people ended up leaving the island.
It was devastating.
It's sad,
It is.
The very people they were supposedly trying to liberate
Yeah,
ended up worse off.
that's Gilly's point, yeah.
So he's saying that the usual story we hear about Zanzibar being a victim of colonialism doesn't tell the whole story.
No, it ignores the suffering that happened under the anti-colonial regime that came after.
Yeah, it's another example of how oversimplifying history can be dangerous.
Right, can hide the truth.
Yeah, the truth. This all goes back to that idea of considering the counterfactual.
Right.
What might have happened if things had gone differently.
Exactly. He's not just focusing on Zanzibar either.
Oh.
He says a lot of countries that became independent after World War II experienced similar problems and setbacks.
Can you give me an example?
Another one he mentions is Guinea-Bissau.
Guinea-Bissau, okay.
The liberation movement there, led by Amilcar Cabral, initially promised a lot of positive change, freedom from Portuguese rule.
Right.
But after they got independence in 1974, the country actually fell into civil war.
Oh.
And the economy tanked.
So the promise of liberation didn't really pan out.
No, not really. Gilly highlights the devastating impact of that conflict.
Yeah.
Thousands were killed or displaced.
Oh, that's awful.
Food production plummeted. He also points out that Cabral's successor, his own half-brother actually,
Oh, wow.
made things even worse with his policies,
Oh, no.
destabilizing the country even further
Yeah.
and leading to widespread human rights abuses.
It's a far cry from the stories we often hear about these liberation movements,
It is, and Gilly's not trying to glorify colonialism.
Right, of course.
He's just trying to point out that the failures of these anti-colonial movements often get overlooked, and that those failures caused a lot of suffering for the people they claim to be liberating.
Yeah, it's like people were suffering no matter who was in charge, right?
It's about looking beyond those simple narratives and really grappling with the complexities of history.
It is a lot to grapple with.
Yeah.
It's pretty sobering,
Yeah, it can be.
But does he offer any hope for the future?
He does. He actually points to some positive things that started happening in the 1980s.
Okay, like what?
He talks about how some former colonies started to realize that they needed to go back to some of those colonial structures and policies if they wanted to achieve economic growth and political stability.
So it's kind of like a Back to the Future scenario.
Yeah, in a way.
Admitting that maybe the colonial powers got some things right.
It's about being pragmatic, not ideological.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, he talks about South Korea and Taiwan,
Okay.
which embraced those market-oriented policies and became part of the global economy.
Right.
They experienced much more economic success than those countries that held onto those anti-Western socialist ideologies.
I see. It's about choosing what works.
Right. Yeah, exactly. He even quotes a speech by Singapore's foreign minister in 1979, Sinnathamby Rajaratnam.
Okay.
He criticized third world leaders for basically adopting the bad habits of their former colonial rulers
Oh, wow.
while rejecting some of the good things they did.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It was. And Gilly thinks subsequent events have kind of proven him right.
So it's about taking responsibility instead of just blaming everything on colonialism.
Exactly. And Gilly supports this with research that shows a connection between colonial rule and economic growth.
Wait, hold on. You're saying that being colonized actually helped some countries economically?
He cites studies that compare how former colonies are doing economically.
Yeah.
And they find that those that were under colonial rule for longer often have better economic indicators.
But couldn't that be because of other things?
Sure, things like natural resources or economic structures that were already in place.
Yeah.
It's a good point, and Gilly knows it's hard to isolate the impact of colonialism completely. But he highlights a study that looks specifically at islands.
Islands? Why islands?
He argues that they're a unique case study
Okay.
because they were discovered by Europeans pretty much randomly.
Ah, okay.
So it wasn't like they were targeted for specific reasons.
So it's more like a natural experiment.
Yeah, exactly. And the study found that islands with longer periods of colonial rule actually had higher income levels, which suggests that colonialism itself played a role in their economic development.
So even though we can't ignore the bad things about colonialism,
Yeah.
there's also evidence to suggest that, in some cases, it might have actually paved the way for future success.
That's exactly what Gilly is saying.
It's mind-blowing, really.
It is. It challenges that assumption that colonialism was always and everywhere harmful.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
Yeah.
But you know what really stood out to me about Gilly's work?
What's that?
The way he connects this whole historical debate to what's happening today
Oh, right.
with censorship and academic freedom. It seems like he really got slammed for his views.
Yeah.
Did.
Death threats, academic censure, you know.
It was rough.
It makes you wonder if we're actually shutting down debate in the very places that should be encouraging it, you know.
Yeah, that's one of Gilly's big points.
Like, where are we supposed to have these tough conversations if not in academia?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He compares it to those political campaigns in Maoist China,
Oh, wow, okay.
where they were obsessed with ideological purity.
Right.
Anyone who stepped out of line was publicly shamed and ostracized.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. It's like, haven't we learned from the past?
Apparently not. Gilly argues that this weaponization of shame, especially online,
Yeah, it's everywhere these days.
has created a climate of fear
Yeah, definitely.
where academics are afraid to challenge the accepted views, especially on topics like colonialism.
So it's like self-censorship. People are too scared to say what they really think because they might get attacked.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Gilly's experienced this firsthand.
Really?
He was invited to give a lecture on German colonialism at Texas Tech University.
And then they took back the invitation after some faculty members basically called him dangerous.
Wow, that's extreme.
It gets worse.
Oh, no.
The university president and provost actually said that there is no case for colonialism.
Seriously?
Yeah, that's like shutting down any possibility of having a real discussion.
It really shows you how powerful ideology can be,
It does.
even in places that are supposed to value open debate.
Yeah, it's troubling.
Gilly argues that this has serious consequences for how we understand the past and for our ability to deal with the problems we face today.
If we can't even talk about colonialism honestly, how can we learn from it?
Exactly. It's like we're stuck
Yeah.
just repeating the same old narrative
Over and over again.
without ever stopping to ask if they're actually true.
Gilly's solution is a more nuanced understanding of history,
Okay, I like that.
one that acknowledges both the good and the bad.
Right, the whole picture.
He thinks that's the only way we can find solutions for the challenges that former colonies face today.
It's about looking beyond those easy judgments and really wrestling with the complexities.
Yeah, it's messy.
It is messy.
Yeah.
Because if we just blindly condemn colonialism
Yeah.
without recognizing that it might have had some positive impacts,
Right.
we risk making the same mistakes again.
Exactly.
And that could hurt progress in the developing world.
Absolutely.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot in this deep dive into Bruce Gilly's work.
We have.
And it seems like we're ending with more questions than answers.
That's what makes it so thought-provoking, though, right?
It is. It challenges us to rethink what we thought we knew.
Makes us confront those uncomfortable truths.
It does. So what do you think, listener?
Where do you stand on all of this?
We've laid out the arguments, explored the history.
Yeah.
Now it's your turn to decide what you believe.
Could a nuanced understanding of the past, one that acknowledges both the positive and negative aspects of colonialism, actually help us address the challenges facing former colonies today?
That's a big question.
It is. And here's another one. If there had been no colonial encounter at all, would those regions be better off today?
Wow, that's a really tough one.
It is. But those are the kinds of questions we hope you'll keep exploring.
Yeah, as you continue your own deep dive into this complex and often misunderstood topic.
Thanks for joining us.
And until next time, keep thinking critically and keep asking those tough questions.